Welcome to Politics in the Pub. It's an unusual tonight, Bob. We don't usually have quite so many people here, so that's the first thing. It's usually a good night, but not quite this jammed in. And usually we just have a talk, but tonight it's in conversation. So I don't know about you, Bob. I feel like I need a guitar or something.
I'm going to bring you next time I go to some of those functions where there's only 3 or 4 seats full. Like obviously you can fill the house, right?
I know about us. So look, I won't take up too much more time. Let me just introduce Bob a bit more fully. Bob Brown was elected to the Senate in 1996 after 10 years as a member of Tasmania's state parliament. In his first speech, Bob raised the threat posed by climate change. Some of the many issues that Bob has raised in the Senate include petrol sniffing in Central Australia, self-determination for West Papua and Tibet, saving Tasmania's ancient forests, obviously opposing the war in Iraq, justice for David Hicks, stopping the sale of the Snowy Hydro, and opposing the dumping of nuclear waste in Australia. Bob was re-elected to the Senate in 2001, following the election of 4 Green senators in 2004. Bob became the parliamentary leader of the Greens in 2005. Tonight Bob's going to talk about greening government, and I'm going to kick off with a few questions, and then there's time for everyone to ask at least 3 questions. Not quite. There will be time for questions, and there's a microphone at some point. I'll ask people to form an orderly queue, which I reckon will get not very far down before it's time to go. But look, Bob, without any further ado, and just so I'm Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute. There's some clipboards floating around about politics in the pub, so if you want to know about future events, I'll talk a bit about them at the end. And I used to work for Bob, so I'm going to use some inside knowledge to ask some really curly questions. No, I was thinking really hard about this, and the first question, Bob, I wanted to ask is, because when I worked for him I never had time to ask him anything, a lot of people obviously think about, yourself and the Greens and where to from here for the Greens. But I actually think that despite all of the attention the Greens have had, there's not really a lot of understanding about the sort of things that you've done in your career. So my first question to you is, given your involvement in things like the Wilderness Society and Bush Heritage and all those other organisations that you've been a part of, how do you see your role in helping to build things that keep delivering, rather than just the day-to-day of politics?
Oh, thank you for that. I'm a born and bred greenie. I've got on the back of the car a sticker because I keep getting people coming up in the street and saying, "Look, I'm not a greenie, but." So I've got a sticker on the back of the car. You can get one. I'm not a greenie, but. But I realised way back that the power in the world is run by organisation, and if you don't have organisation, you'll get run over. And also it's pyramidal, and it's well moneyed, and it's got outreach, and it tries power. Just look at today's or this week's ads from the Australian Coal Association on climate change to see how much purchase that gives them. Quite unwarranted, but nevertheless it's there. But anyway, it's been a long time evolving. I've come out of the 60s and 70s where we wanted to have consensus decision making and everybody equal and no movement until everybody understood everything. And we realised we were getting flattened as we waited to make ourselves perfect. The very imperfect power brokers on the planet run right over the top. So you've got to have a mixture of those two things, and I hope the Greens is that. But the Wilderness Society came out of the Lake Pedder Action Committee back in 1976. We set up in the kitchen at Liffey in central Tasmania, and it was there in winter, and 16 greenies in beanies. But Kevin Kiernan came along with the idea that we should change the name from the Southwest Action Committee, which had been pulverised by the Premier of the day, Electric Eric, and change it to the wilderness, the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. You know, it's all very, sound all very middle class, if you like. And I learned from that. We rapidly grew, and through the Franklin campaign, we got to learn to relate to people. Colour footage had come in. I went to the first meeting on the Franklin campaign in a downtown hall in Melbourne. We were expecting about 20 people there, and it was packed to the rafters. And we had a little film by then, which Paul Smith had got me to get a camera for, a wind-up Bolex camera from a second-hand shop in Sydney, and we went back down the Franklin for the second time in '77 and took this footage, and people loved it. And we, anyway, the organisation grew. It worked on consensus decision-making, but by the time we got to the Franklin campaign, 6,000 people went to Strawn. Trained all over, including here in Canberra. There'll be people here tonight who will have been in amongst those affinity groups, training to go down there to stick together when they were arrested in the cold, perhaps beaten up. We didn't know what was going to happen, and it worked beautifully. But I can remember Chris Harris saying after the blockade, 600 people are arrested. 600 went to jail, 1,500 arrested, saying that the beauty about consensus decision making at the blockade was that no decisions were ever made. We did nothing outrageous. We simply hung on to each other. And I was in jail and brought out to a little interview room. Honestly, a single light bulb on a cord, two chairs, cement walls all around, no windows, a table in the middle, and the superintendent of police said, well, Dr. Brown, I understand there's going to be violence in the southwest. We want you to go back out and call the blockade off. We know what's going on inside the ranks, and there's being violence planned, and so on. Well, you know, I knew the people I was with. We had outreach. We knew what we were doing there. We were totally committed to non-violence. And I said to him, well, I won't, you know. If you've got evidence of that, arrest whoever it is that's planning this. Make sure you prevent it. And nothing happened. When it came to bush heritage, there was a couple of big blocks of forest in the Liffey Valley that came up for sale, and I'd just come back from the US and I'd been given $40,000 for being at the Franklin blockade. It was really a gift to everybody who'd been at that blockade, but they were going to bulldoze these forests, so I got a friend to bid for them. We ended up buying the 2 blocks of forest, which are now on the edge of the World Heritage Area, and I had a $200,000 debt. And so I had to take the hat around, and it was bankruptcy, here we come, but somehow we managed to pull through that, get a little 8-hectare block up in the fan palm forests of the Daintree, and start to move it to and it was just the right time. And so that organisation, now centred in Melbourne, turns over more than $10 million a year. It's got 1 million hectares protected. It's got 100 and something staff, and it's just growing because you know, Australians took to it. I just took an idea that was then in place in America, which was working there, and was fortunate in those circumstances to be able to help it to build. With the Greens, we had a very rocky time. We had a conference we had a meeting in Liffey. Other people came along, called the Liffey Group. Let's have a meeting in Sydney to set up a National Greens Party. This is 1985. Don't know how many of you were at that. But we got 500 people together over Easter of 1985 or 86, which voted by a big majority not to form a Greens Party. But 5 or 6 years later we got there, and here we are. But organisation is incredibly important, and having faith in each other, recognising we're all fault-ridden human beings, but we have an aspiration for the future. And you know, today I was talked at the press club finally, I don't want to be too long about this, about big breath, global democracy. Why can't we have a global parliament to sort out human affairs? It is democracy or guns. it has to be one person, one vote, one value. Why not advocate that we in Australia could host it? Well, the lines are ringing hot, you know. The conspiracy theorists will be out there. But that's an idea, by the way, that's 200 years old. And here we are consigning all the power to the big non-representative corporations and so on. So I'm just joining. There's moves in the United Nations from Europe and back from America. We've Rachel Seawart's here. We've had a couple of votes in the Senate in the last few months to support these moves in the United Nations for a People's Assembly next to the United Nations, which just debates the issues. It would be unempowered to start off with. Voted down by both the big parties both times. These are the parties that go to Iraq or Afghanistan with to give those people democracy using military intervention, but can't through peace think about this very frightening prospect of one person, one vote, one value. But organisationally we're going to have it, but we're not going to make it. So I've just learnt that organisations and people's well-being come together in that way.
You talked there about the tension between, you know, consensus decision making and actually sometimes needing to make a decision. One of the tensions that I think is so interesting about you is that you always, you know, I've seen you up close for many years, you're polite, you're respectful, you treat other people very well. But at the same time, your job requires you often to speak truth to power, and Bob's the son of a policeman, I don't know if you know, so getting
That's
arrested...
That's why I'm so good.
So getting arrested is, I'm sure, no small thing. But my question to you is a specific one. On the day that you literally stood up to George Bush, I see the two parts of Bob Brown sort of in complete in collision, basically. The polite, respectful person and the person who's not going to sit there and be silent, you know, when something needs to be said. So what were you thinking that morning?
Well, I was terrified, I have to tell you. And my father, who was a policeman, a country policeman, I was born at Oberon, and we travelled around, went to school at Trunky Creek up between here and Goulburn and so on. But he had he was, I think, a very good man, but he'd rather than put somebody in the local lockup, give them a kick and say, don't you ever do that again or you'll find yourself before the magistrate. But he had a lot of common sense, and he didn't he suffered lots of fools, I suppose, but he didn't suffer big-headed people very well, including judges, people who wound down their window and said, I'm the local bishop, you shouldn't be booking me, etc. And I think I got a little bit of that ability to look at false self-presentation or false regard for office, even, in a reasonable way off him, perhaps. When George Bush was coming to town, I was thinking about this, and we had the two Australians in Guantanamo Bay. We had backed, or John Howard had backed George Bush into Iraq against international law, and as the day approached, it became more and more difficult. Do you sit there and say nothing? It's easy. It's more comfortable. You can go outside and hold a press conference. Or do you speak up? Now, we had a vote in the Senate to have a joint sitting of the Houses of Parliament. There is no provision for that anywhere under the Constitution or in the parliamentary rules. And the Speaker of the House would be in control of the Senators. There is no provision for that under the rules. And the clerk had made that clear to me when I'd asked him about it. Nevertheless, I moved that we greet George Bush in the Great Hall of Parliament, not inside our elected assembly. Nevertheless, because the rules say that a stranger will not go onto the floor of one of our elected assemblies. Anyway, he did. And when the time came, I'd spoken with Kerry Nettle, our Green Senator from New South Wales, the day before, to tell her that I was thinking about doing this. speaking up on Iraq and Guantanamo Bay, and when the moment was coming, Bush, you could hear a pin drop when he walked into that parliament. It was like the second coming. I was just astonished at the good behaviour in the place. Everything was packed. To this superhuman emanation